On November 11, 1944, Lieutenant Rudolph Shaw of the Army Air Force experienced engine troubles while making a reconnaissance flight over Indochina. Unable to make it back to the safe haven of Allied territory, Shaw crash-landed in the Tonkin area of northern Vietnam. Immediately, local Viet Minh resistance fighters found Shaw and took him back to their base in the Pac Bo area, just miles from the Chinese border. At Pac Bo, Vietnamese leader and spiritual head of the revolutionary Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh, greeted and introduced himself in English to the shocked lieutenant. Though Lieutenant Shaw did not realize at the time, the man who had just introduced himself would become one of America's fiercest enemies within a decade. The United States would end up trying to move heaven and earth to track down and kill the man who rescued Lieutenant Shaw and several other U.S. airmen in late 1944 and early 1945. But before then, they worked together to defeat a common enemy in Indochina. This story is about that initial friendship spawned in the late summer months of 1944. Four years earlier, in late 1940, just months after the fall of France, Japanese troops had invaded Vietnam and swiftly taken control. They had quickly forced an unequal agreement on the French administrators in charge. The French in Indochina, loyal to the Vichy government, retained only nominal political and legal control while allowing the Japanese to station 40,000 troops in the country. At the same time, sensing a potential power vacuum, Vietnamese revolutionaries headed by Ho Chi Minh started limited guerrilla uprisings against both French and Japanese troops. But after the French and Japanese reached a ceasefire, together they turned their guns on the Vietnamese revolutionaries, causing them to disperse and flee. Communists in the south had also attempted an uprising in Saigon at the same time, but it too failed in spectacular fashion when French troops brutally repressed the attempted coup and executed the leaders. The Vietnamese had already been chafing for nearly a century under harsh and repressive French colonial rule, and now they faced a brutal Japanese occupation to supplement it. In response, the following year in May of 1941, Vietnamese communists led by Ho Chi Minh created the League for the Independence of Vietnam, popularly known as the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh formed the Viet Minh to fight towards national independence from the French and Japanese and served as the movement's spiritual and political center. U.S. interest in Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam had begun even before the late 1944 Viet Minh rescues of downed pilots like Lieutenant Shaw. Before the war, the U.S. had virtually no contact with Vietnam. By late 1942, Ho Chi Minh appeared in U.S. diplomatic cables for the first time in a dispatch from American Ambassador Clarence E. Gauss to the State Department. Nothing of significance came from this initial report, and Gauss and the State Department did not even know who Ho Chi Minh was. At the time, the U.S. had few sources themselves in Indochina, and especially in Vietnam. Most of their information came secondhand from French sources, with some coming from the Chinese at the border who worked with the U.S. Army and Army Air Force. The official U.S. policy on cooperation with resistance groups in Indochina was to do nothing, as an October 1944 memo from President Roosevelt to his Secretary of State Cordell Hull shows. However, by 1944, leaders in the Army and Army Air Force, as well as Navy and intelligence agents, had already been involved with numerous intelligence operations in northern Indochina. Sometimes those operations involved Vietnamese assets, but they mainly relied on French assistance, and American commanders largely worked with French resistance groups. Navy Commodore Milton Miles was one of the earliest Americans who took an interest in Vietnam. From 1942 to 1945, Miles was stationed in southern China, mainly at Chongqing. First, Miles served as Naval Observer and Far East Director of the OSS, then as Commander of U.S. Navy Group China and Deputy Director of the Sino-American Cooperative Organization. As Commander of Naval Group China and an OSS Director, Miles was tasked with overseeing espionage and guerrilla operations in southern China, as well as preparing for a potential Allied landing along the coast. Sensing that operations might potentially take place in Vietnam too, Miles sought to extend his intelligence network south. The Commodore worked with the French naval officer to build a network of intelligence agents inside Vietnam, but the French military mission, which supported returning Indochina back to its colonialist past, attempted to consistently hamper their operations. Still, Miles and the OSS cultivated an intelligence network through French agents inside Indochina, with many of them secretly working in French government agencies and intelligence offices. His agents sent a stream of information on Japanese field fortifications, troop movements, and bombing targets. Eventually, Viet Minh representatives started to supplant the French agents as collaborators with the US. Miles and the OSS also started planning to utilize the mountain tribes in the central highlands of Vietnam in guerrilla warfare and espionage against Japanese troops. Among the tribes included the Thai, the Miao, the Hmong, and the Nung. Miles developed his plan from an earlier proposal submitted by Lieutenant George Devereux, a psychological warfare expert on Miles' staff. Miles' plan was as ambitious as it was dangerous. He wanted to parachute 20 special agents into the Central Highlands town of Kon Tum. Once landed, they would ally with local tribesmen, supply them with arms, ammunition, and medicine through airdrops, and organize them into bands of guerrilla fighters. But squabbles with the French, and between the OSS and Navy Group China, ultimately forced the cancellation of these plans. Apart from Commander Miles' network, the most reliable U.S. source for intelligence in Indochina at the time was the GBT Group. The GBT Group consisted of former employees for a Saigon oil company and was composed of representatives from Canada, the United States, and Great Britain. The GBT Group was ostensibly created to look after Western property in Indochina during the war. However, it quickly morphed into an espionage group and started cultivating networks of undercover agents in Vietnam to provide intelligence on transportation, industry, shipping, and airfields. It was only in late 1944 that U.S. personnel started to encounter the Vietnamese in person in the field. The Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, planned morale operations in Indochina with the intention of discrediting the Japanese and disseminating pro-American propaganda. However, the morale operations planners also perceived the native Indochinese as mentally inferior and lacking the psychological abilities of Americans. They suggested the Vietnamese were vain, and their subservience and mercenary proclivities were inherent barriers to collaboration. The OSS planners thought the simple and almost childlike people would benefit from leaflets showing brightly colored American inventions and diminutive pictures of the Japanese troops. Americans and Viet Minh representatives met each other in person for the first time in the late summer of 1944. Americans and a Viet Minh delegation met in Kunming, China in August and September, but the delegation failed to impress the Americans. They found the Viet Minh unorganized and politically naive, and they doubted their claims of 200,000 members in northern Vietnam. It was a few months later, in November, when Viet Minh revolutionaries rescued Lieutenant Shaw after his crash near Pac Bo. Ho Chi Minh and two colleagues secretly led Shaw through the northern border and into southern China. From there, Shaw flew to Kunming and regrouped at the U.S. Air-Ground Air Services base. Ho had to make his way to Kunming on foot, and he arrived after authorities had already repatriated Lieutenant Shaw back stateside. Nonetheless, Ho stayed in Kunming, which led to a meeting with U.S. Army officers Charles Fenn and Claire Chennault in March. Fenn, a captain in the OSS at the time, would later write an extensive biography on Ho after his death. Fenn had sought out a meeting with him after becoming aware of his role locating downed pilots and providing intelligence on Japanese troop movements and locations. Fenn also knew that Ho frequently visited the Army's Office of War Information facility in Kunming to read copies of Time magazine. Ho was very interested in meeting with U.S. Army officers because he viewed an alliance with the U.S. as a precursor for throwing out the French colonialists and creating an independent Vietnam. Meanwhile, back in South Vietnam, a Japanese coup erupted on March 9, 1945. The Japanese threw out the French administrators and took over control of Vietnam, installing a puppet government headed by Emperor Bao Dai. The Japanese takeover eliminated many of the OSS's intelligence networks that had relied on French administration, including the GBT Group. As a result, Americans began to take an even bigger interest in the Viet Minh revolutionaries and their potential intelligence gathering capabilities. Fenn met with Ho and his colleague, Pham Van Dong, on March 17th at the Dragon's Gate Cafe in Kunming. Fenn asked Ho whether the Viet Minh were a communist organization, and Ho evaded directly answering. Days later, Ho met with Chennault at the 14th Air Force headquarters. Chennault signed a picture for Ho, and before leaving, Captain Fenn gave him 6 brand new Colt 45s from the OSS. In April, OSS member Archimedes Patti arrived in Kunming to take stock of the situation with the Viet Minh. Patti consulted with his superiors in the OSS on how to proceed. On April 26, General Albert C. Wedemeyer, commander of U.S. forces in China, authorized Patti to introduce OSS operatives into Indochina for intelligence and demolition purposes. Ho returned to Pac Bo with a U.S. Army operator and a GBT member, both Asian Americans, who reported back to the Americans at Kunming. The OSS continued to use Ho and the Viet Minh as intelligence assets. They airdropped them limited amounts of materiel and radio equipment at their Pac Bo base in exchange for intelligence reports and more pilot rescues. An OSS medic that had parachuted into Pac Bo even helped nurse Ho back to health when he was suffering from dysentery and malaria. The OSS referred to Ho and the Viet Minh operators as Deer Team and continued to investigate the group's communist affiliations. On July 16th, a colonel working in the OSS radioed back to headquarters in Kunming, insisting the group were freedom fighters and anti-French but not communist. The OSS misjudged the Viet Minh. Though a nationalist organization formed to seek independence, the Viet Minh's leadership was composed of hardcore communists and was conceived at the 8th plenum of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. In July, Major Allison K. Thomas, the leader of Deer Team, and 6 other Americans parachuted into northern Tonkin to a welcoming Viet Minh group. The Americans had just started training the Viet Minh a month earlier in southern China. Thomas and Ho had a long conversation upon his arrival, where Ho expressed severe anti-French sentiments. Thomas stayed for a few months in northern Vietnam, and 4 additional OSS men joined them. This collaboration between the OSS and the Viet Minh has come under considerable scrutiny by later observers and many historians, especially those in France. They criticized the US for arming the Viet Minh for the later war against the French and for refusing to help anti-Vietnamese French resistance groups in the area. However, the arms the OSS gave the Viet Minh were minimal by the time the French War started, and OSS collaboration with the Viet Minh had limited military effectiveness. Intelligence-wise, the OSS collected very little information on the Viet Minh themselves, and the main effect of the brief US collaboration was likely psychological. It annoyed and angered the French while enhancing the prestige of the Viet Minh among locals. In August, Deer Team began to give the Viet Minh soldiers weapons training in Pac Bo. Patti arrived in Hanoi on August 22nd to immediate greetings from Viet Minh representatives, and a military band serenaded him by playing the US national anthem. Ho met with Patti on the 26th, and again in early September, where he complained about Chinese intentions in Indochina and insisted that the Viet Minh were not communists. Ho even started to offer Vietnam as a potential hub for US investment and indicated a willingness to grant special concessions to US commercial interests. Patti, unsure of the future of the ambiguous US policy in Indochina, refused to make any official guarantee to Ho and the Viet Minh. OSS reports on the Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh consistently remarked they were not communists, but rather nationalists and freedom fighters. Ho impressed many of the OSS officials he encountered, who found him sincere and smart. These favorable accounts were in stark contrast to the reports on other Vietnamese revolutionaries who they derided in comparison to Ho. Meanwhile, Patti provided Ho with a translation of the Declaration of Independence, which Ho wanted to use for his own upcoming independence speech. On September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, with several OSS officers among the crowd of thousands. Coincidentally, several low-flying American P-38 planes buzzed the crowd as Ho was giving his speech. Many in the crowd likely assumed that, along with the OSS officers in attendance, this meant the US was supporting Ho in the DRV. They would find these hopes shattered within a few months. The OSS was also active in southern Vietnam at the time. Colonel A. Peter Dewey headed a contingent that was negotiating with the Viet Minh's Committee of the South in Saigon. The OSS had attempted to mediate conflicts between the Vietnamese and the French troops, who were recently released from jail and rearmed under British Major General Douglas Gracey. Dewey, upset at the rearming of the troops and their vicious reprisals against Vietnamese civilians, went to see Gracey at British headquarters but was rebuffed. Gracey demanded Dewey leave the country, but did agree to moderate some of his tactics. On September 26, as Dewey was in his jeep leaving for the airport, Viet Minh troops fired at and killed him. He was just 28 years old. An official OSS investigation into the incident concluded the Viet Minh had not acted on purpose and likely mistook the jeep as being French and not American, but the damage was already done. Ho encountered several other U.S. officials in the fall and winter of 1945, including representatives from the Strategic Services Unit, the successor to the OSS, which had been dissolved in September. Ho used these liaisons to send letters to President Truman and Secretary of State James Burns. Those letters were never answered. Dewey's death marked the beginning of the end for the OSS and American cooperation with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. The OSS had disbanded officially a week earlier on September 20th, and a series of successor organizations took over American foreign intelligence and covert operations. Dear Team's mission ceased to exist. As French-Vietnamese negotiations ratcheted up in late 1945 and 1946, U.S. observers began to play an even more peripheral role in the Indo-Chinese conflict. Eventually, by the mid-1950s, the OSS's final successor, the CIA, would be back in business in Vietnam, trying to infiltrate Hanoi in the north and the Viet Minh successor, the Viet Cong, in the south. But by then, memories of OSS-Viet Minh collaborations had become a distant dream, shot to death in the rice paddies of Vietnam.